The dust cloud rising from the stagecoach wheels was the first sign anyone in Pecos, Texas, had that their quiet afternoon was about to change. And when the door opened, a young woman stepped down clutching nothing but a single envelope pressed against her chest like it contained all the answers in the world. Franklin Xavier stood outside the mercantile, his worn boots planted firmly on the wooden planks as he watched the stranger descend from the coach. He was 26 years old, tall and lean from years of working cattle under the merciless Texas sun, with dark hair that fell just past his collar and eyes the color of prairie grass after a rare summer rain. He had come into town for supplies, nothing more, but something about the way this woman looked around with equal parts determination, and fear made him pause mid-step. She was young, perhaps 22 or 23, with auburn hair pinned back in a simple style that had come loose during travel. Her dress was plain but well made, though dusty from the journey, and her face held a quiet strength despite the worry lines creasing her forehead. She clutched that letter like a lifeline as she approached the first person she saw, which happened to be old Mr. Henderson, who ran the telegraph office. Franklin watched from a distance as Henderson shook his head, gesturing vaguely down the street. The woman's shoulders sagged slightly, but she straightened them again and moved on to the next person. This pattern repeated 3 more times, and Franklin felt something stir in his chest. He knew that look, that desperate search for something or someone. He had worn it himself once, years ago, when he had been searching for his father's killer. Finally, she turned in his direction. Their eyes met across the dusty street, and Franklin found himself walking toward her before he had consciously decided to move. Up close, she was even younger than he had initially thought, with freckles scattered across her nose and striking blue eyes that seemed too weary for someone so young. "Excuse me," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I am looking for someone. Perhaps you might know him." Franklin tipped his hat. "I have lived around Pecos for near 10 years now. I might could help. Who are you searching for?" She hesitated, her fingers tightening on the envelope. "Thomas Monroe. Do you know where I might find him?" The name meant nothing to Franklin, and he was about to say so when he noticed the postmark on the letter. It was dated 6 months prior. "Thomas Monroe," he repeated slowly. "Cannot say I know the name. What brings you looking for him?" The woman's face flickered with something between hope and despair. "He was my brother's business partner. My brother died 3 months ago, and before he passed, he told me to come here to find Thomas Monroe. He said this man would help me, that he owed my brother a great debt." Franklin glanced around the street. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. "What is your name, Miss Jane Morrison?" she said. "And I have traveled from Missouri to get here." "Franklin Xavier," he replied. "Let me ask around proper. This town is not so big that a man can hide in it, but names sometimes get mixed up. Did your brother say anything else about this Thomas Monroe?" Jane shook her head, then seemed to reconsider. "Only that he was a good man who would honor his word, and that if I ever needed anything, I should find him here in Pecos." The stagecoach driver called out that they would be departing in 10 minutes for anyone continuing on. Jane did not turn around. Franklin could see the exhaustion in every line of her body, the way she swayed slightly on her feet as though she might collapse at any moment. "Have you eaten today?" he asked. "I had some bread this morning," Jane said, though her stomach chose that moment to growl audibly, betraying her. Franklin made a decision. "Come on. Let us get you something to eat while I think on this. There is a decent place just down the street. My treat." Jane hesitated, clearly weighing the propriety of accepting help from a stranger against her very real need for food and assistance. Practicality won. "Thank you. That is very kind." The restaurant was small but clean, run by a Mexican family who had been in Pecos longer than most of the white settlers. Maria Garcia, the owner, raised an eyebrow at Franklin when he walked in with Jane but said nothing, simply showing them to a corner table and bringing water without being asked. "2 bowls of whatever you have hot," Franklin said, "and some bread." When Maria had gone, Jane carefully placed the letter on the table between them. Franklin could see now that it was worn from much handling, the edges soft and the paper creased. She had been holding on to this for a long time. "Tell me about your brother," Franklin said gently. Jane's eyes glistened, but no tears fell. "Samuel. He was 10 years older than me, raised me after our parents died when I was 12. He was everything to me, really. The only family I had left." "What happened to him?" "Pneumonia," Jane said quietly. "It took him fast. He was sick for only 2 weeks before the end. And in those last days, when he knew he was not going to make it, he kept talking about this debt, about Thomas Monroe. He made me promise I would come here if anything happened to him. He said this man would take care of me, would help me get situated." Franklin absorbed this. "And you have no other family? No one back in Missouri?" "No one," Jane confirmed. "Samuel never married. It was always just the 2 of us. And now it is just me." Maria brought the food, a rich stew thick with vegetables and chunks of beef. Jane ate with careful restraint, clearly trying not to appear too desperate, but Franklin could see she was famished. He let her eat in silence for a few minutes before speaking again. "I will help you find this Thomas Monroe," he said, "or find out what happened to him. A man does not just vanish without trace." Jane looked up at him, and for the first time since she had stepped off that stagecoach, something like hope flickered in her eyes. "Why would you do that for me? You do not even know me." Franklin thought about that. The truth was complicated. Part of it was simple decency, the code of the West that said you helped a person in need. But there was something else too, something in the way she held herself together despite everything falling apart, the quiet dignity in her desperation that called to something deep in his chest. "Because someone once helped me when I had nothing," he said finally. "And because it is the right thing to do." They finished their meal as the sun set completely, and Franklin paid Maria while Jane waited by the door. Outside, the street was quieter now, with most folks heading home for supper. The saloon at the far end of town was just beginning to light its lamps, and Franklin could hear the faint sound of a piano starting up. "You have a place to stay tonight?" Franklin asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. Jane shook her head. "I used most of my money for the stagecoach fare. I have a little left, but not enough for many nights in a boarding house." Franklin considered this. "There is a widow woman, Mrs. Patterson, who runs a respectable boarding house near the church. Let me take you there and speak with her. We will work something out." "I cannot accept charity," Jane said firmly. "I will not be a burden." "It is not charity if you work for it," Franklin replied. "Mrs. Patterson is getting on in years. I am sure she could use help around the place. You help her, she gives you room and board." "Fair trade." Jane studied him for a long moment as if trying to determine whether she could trust him. Finally, she nodded. "All right, thank you, Mr. Xavier." "Franklin," he said. "Just Franklin. Then you must call me Jane." They walked through the darkening streets toward the boarding house, their footsteps echoing on the wooden sidewalks. Franklin found himself very aware of her presence beside him, the way she moved with quiet grace despite her obvious exhaustion. He wondered what it took for a young woman to travel alone all the way from Missouri with nothing but a letter and a promise from a dying brother. Mrs. Patterson was a stern-looking woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She listened to Franklin's explanation with her arms crossed, occasionally glancing at Jane with an appraising look. "I suppose I could use some help," she said finally. "Arthritis makes the washing difficult these days, but I run a respectable house. No men visitors, no liquor, church on Sunday." "Yes, madam," Jane said quickly. "I would be grateful for the opportunity. Can you cook?" "Yes, madam. My brother said I made the best apple pie in Missouri." Mrs. Patterson's stern expression softened just slightly. "Well then, we shall see about that. I will give you a trial period. 1 week. You work hard and follow the rules, you can stay on. Room and board in exchange for help with cooking, cleaning, and washing." "Fair enough." "More than fair," Jane said. "Thank you." Franklin left them making arrangements and stepped back out into the night. He had his own place to get back to, a small ranch about 5 miles outside of town, where he ran a modest herd of cattle with the help of 2 hired hands. But as he rode home under a sky full of stars, he found his thoughts returning again and again to Jane Morrison and her mysterious letter. The next morning, Franklin was back in town before the sun had fully risen. He told himself it was because he needed to make good on his promise to help find Thomas Monroe, but part of him knew he just wanted to see Jane again, to make sure she was all right. He started his search at the land office, where a clerk named Peters kept meticulous records of every property transaction in the county. Peters was a thin man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers who took pride in his work. "Thomas Monroe," Peters repeated, running his finger down a ledger. "Thomas Monroe. No, I have no record of anyone by that name buying or selling property in the last 5 years. What about before that?" Peters pulled out older ledgers, checking each one carefully. Finally, he shook his head. "Nothing. Are you certain he was in Pecos?" "That is what I am trying to determine," Franklin said. His next stop was the post office. The postmaster, a friendly man named Robertson, was more helpful. "Thomas Monroe. Yes, I remember that name. Used to get letters here, about 6 or 7 months back. Maybe a dozen in total over the course of a few months." Franklin felt a surge of hope. "Where were the letters from?" "Missouri, as I recall, from a Samuel Morrison." So Jane's brother had been writing to this Thomas Monroe. That confirmed at least part of her story, not that Franklin had doubted her. "Do you know where the letters were delivered?" Robertson scratched his head. "That is the odd thing. Monroe always came to pick them up himself, never had a regular address, just said he was passing through on business." "What did he look like?" "Tall fellow, well-dressed. Spoke like an educated man. Had a scar on his left hand, I remember that, across the back like from a knife or something." "When did you last see him?" Robertson thought about that. "Must have been 5 or 6 months ago. He came in, asked if there was any mail for him. There was not. He said he was moving on, heading west to California. Asked me to forward any mail to San Francisco, care of general delivery." Franklin felt his heart sink. If Thomas Monroe had gone to California, finding him would be nearly impossible. But he had to tell Jane what he had learned. He found her at the boarding house, up to her elbows in soapy water, washing sheets in a large tub out back. She had tied her hair back with a simple ribbon and rolled up her sleeves, and despite the humble nature of the work, she attacked it with determination. "Jane," he called out, and she looked up, her face brightening when she saw him. "Franklin, have you learned something?" He told her what he had discovered at the post office. He watched as the hope drained from her face, replaced by something that looked like devastation barely held in check. "California," she repeated numbly. "He went to California." "It seems so," Franklin said gently. "I am sorry." Jane stood there for a moment, her wet hands hanging at her sides, water dripping onto the dirt. Then she squared her shoulders in that way he was beginning to recognize and went back to scrubbing the sheets. "Well then," she said, her voice only slightly unsteady, "I suppose that is that. I will stay here and work for Mrs. Patterson. It is honest work and I am grateful for it. Franklin found himself moving closer. "Jane, wait. Let me see the letter your brother gave you." She dried her hands on her apron and pulled the envelope from her pocket. It was always with her, he noticed. She handed it to him carefully, as though it were fragile. Franklin opened it and read the contents for the first time. The handwriting was shaky, clearly written by a dying man, but the words were clear enough. "Jane, if you are reading this, I am gone. I am sorry to leave you alone, but I have made arrangements. Go to Pecos, Texas. Find Thomas Monroe. He owes me a great debt, and he is a man of honor. He will take care of you. Tell him I sent you, and tell him the debt is paid if he sees you settled and safe. Trust him. He will not fail you. Your loving brother, Samuel." Franklin read the letter twice, his mind working through the implications. "Jane, there is something here that does not add up." "What do you mean?" "Your brother writes as though Thomas Monroe will be in Pecos when you arrive. But Monroe left months before your brother died. They were corresponding, so your brother must have known Monroe was moving on." Jane frowned, taking the letter back and reading it again herself. "I do not understand. Why would Samuel send me here if Thomas Monroe was gone?" "Unless," Franklin said slowly, "the debt was not with Thomas Monroe specifically, or unless your brother knew something we do not." "I do not follow." Franklin paced a few steps, thinking. "What did your brother do for work?" "He was in business. Import and export mainly. Goods from the east going west, sometimes the other way around. He traveled quite a bit for it. And Thomas Monroe was his partner in this. That is what he told me. They were working on some large venture together. Samuel seemed excited about it, said it would set us up comfortable for life. But then he got sick, and everything just fell apart." Franklin felt like he was grasping at threads that kept slipping through his fingers. There was a puzzle here, but he could not quite see the shape of it yet. "May I keep looking into this?" he asked. "There may be more to find." Jane looked at him with those clear blue eyes, and Franklin felt something shift in his chest. "You have already done so much. I cannot ask you to do more." "You are not asking. I am offering." She smiled then, a real smile that transformed her whole face, and Franklin felt his breath catch. "Then yes. Thank you. I would be grateful for any help you can give." Over the next several days, Franklin found himself in town more often than he had any practical reason to be. He told himself it was because he was investigating the Thomas Monroe mystery, and that was partly true. He talked to everyone who might have known the man, pieced together a picture of someone who had spent a few months in Pecos conducting business of some vague kind before moving on west. But he also found himself stopping by the boarding house, ostensibly to update Jane on his findings, but really just to see her. She was settling in well, he saw. Mrs. Patterson had warmed to her considerably after tasting that apple pie Jane had mentioned, and the old woman now spoke of her in almost fond terms. Jane herself seemed to be adapting to her new circumstances with remarkable resilience. The devastation he had seen when she learned Monroe was gone had been replaced by a quiet determination to make the best of things. She worked hard, never complained, and treated everyone she met with kindness and respect. Franklin found himself drawn to her in a way he had not experienced before. He had known plenty of women, even courted a few, but there was something different about Jane. Maybe it was the strength he saw in her, the way she faced hardship without breaking. Maybe it was the vulnerability she tried so hard to hide. Maybe it was just the way she smiled when she saw him coming down the street. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after Jane had arrived in Pecos, Franklin was at the saloon having a drink with his friend Cal Peterson when he overheard something that made his ears perk up. Two men were playing cards at a nearby table, and one of them was telling a story about a business deal gone wrong. Yeah, the fellow had big plans, was going to set up a whole trading network from Texas to California, had it all worked out on paper. But then his partner back east died sudden-like, and the whole thing fell apart. Last I heard, he headed to San Francisco to try to salvage something from the mess. Franklin set down his drink and walked over to the table. "Excuse me, gentlemen. I could not help but overhear." "Who were you talking about?" The man who had been speaking, a grizzled fellow with a tobacco-stained beard, looked up. "Monroe, Thomas Monroe, you know him." "Not personally," Franklin said carefully, "but I am trying to find information about him. You say his partner back east died." "That is what I heard. They were putting together this venture, needed capital from both ends. Monroe was handling the western side, partner was handling the eastern side. Partner died, money dried up, whole thing collapsed." "When did you hear this?" "Oh, couple months back." "Monroe was pretty torn up about it. Said the fellow was a good man, that he hated to see his family left with nothing." Franklin felt pieces clicking into place in his mind. "This partner, did you ever hear his name? Morrison, I think. Something like that. Samuel Morrison, Jane's brother." It all made sense now. The business venture, the letters back and forth, the debt Samuel had mentioned. But if the business had fallen apart, what had Samuel meant about Monroe taking care of Jane? Franklin thanked the men and left the saloon, his mind racing. He needed to talk to Jane, but he also needed to think through what this meant. If Thomas Monroe had cared about Samuel Morrison, if he had felt obligated to look after Samuel's family, then the letter made sense. But Monroe had left before Samuel died, probably not knowing his partner was even sick. Which meant Jane had come all this way following instructions meant for a man who was long gone. And that man probably had no idea he was needed. Franklin found Jane in the small garden behind the boarding house, pulling weeds in the vegetable patch Mrs. Patterson maintained. The afternoon sun caught the red highlights in her hair, and she hummed softly to herself as she worked. She looked almost content, and Franklin hated to disturb that peace with what he had learned. "Jane," he said, and she looked up with that smile that was becoming so familiar. "Franklin. I was hoping you would come by. Mrs. Patterson made extra biscuits this morning, and I saved you some." "That is kind, but I need to talk to you about something I learned." Her smile faded, replaced by concern. "What is it?" He told her everything the man at the saloon had said, watching as she processed the information. When he finished, she sat back on her heels, her hands resting in her lap. "So Samuel and Thomas Monroe were true partners," she said quietly. "And when Samuel died, it destroyed their business venture. It seems that way. Then Thomas Monroe probably never received Samuel's last letter, the one telling him I would be coming." "No," Franklin agreed. "I do not believe he did." Jane was quiet for a long moment, staring at the turned earth of the garden. When she spoke again, her voice was steady. "Then I am truly on my own. There is no one coming to help, no debt to be called in, just me." Franklin knelt down beside her. "You are not alone, Jane." She looked at him, and he saw tears threatening to spill over, though she refused to let them fall. "I have nothing, Franklin. No family, no money, no prospects. I am entirely dependent on the charity of a woman I met 2 weeks ago. My brother thought he was sending me to safety, but he sent me to nothing." "He sent you to me," Franklin said, and the words were out before he could think better of them. Jane blinked, surprise replacing the sorrow in her eyes. "What?" Franklin knew he should be more careful, should think this through, but his heart was speaking faster than his head could keep up. "You came to Pecos with nothing but a letter, looking for help. And maybe Thomas Monroe was not here to give it, but I am. And Jane, I want to help you. Not out of obligation or debt, but because in these past 2 weeks I have come to care about you, to care about what happens to you." "Franklin," she whispered, And now the tears did fall, tracking clean lines down her dusty cheeks. He reached out and gently wiped them away with his thumb. "I know this is sudden. I know we have known each other hardly any time at all, but there is something here, Jane. Tell me you feel it too." "I do," she said. "I have felt it almost from the first moment, but I thought it was just gratitude or desperation or wishful thinking. And now I think it might be something more." Franklin took her hands in his, feeling the calluses that had formed from her hard work, the strength in her fingers. "I have a ranch. It is not much, but it is mine. A house, some land, cattle. I make a decent living. I could provide for you, Jane. I could give you the safety and security your brother wanted for you. Are you?" Jane hesitated, searching his face. "Are you proposing marriage?" The word hung between them in the golden afternoon light. Was he? Franklin examined his own heart and found the answer clear and certain. "Yes," he said. "I am. I know it is fast. I know we should probably take more time, court proper. But Jane, life is short and uncertain. Your brother's death proved that. And when you find something good, something real, I think you should hold on to it." Jane was quiet, and Franklin felt his heart hammering in his chest. He had thrown caution to the wind, had spoken from his heart without his usual careful consideration. She could say no. She probably should say no. They barely knew each other. It was madness. "Yes," Jane said. Franklin was not sure he had heard correctly. "Yes. Yes, I will marry you." Jane was smiling now, tears still falling but her whole face alight with joy. "You are right. Life is too short and too uncertain, and I think maybe Samuel sent me to Pecos not for Thomas Monroe but for you. Maybe this was what was meant to happen all along." Franklin pulled her to her feet and into his arms, and they stood there in the garden holding each other as the sun moved across the sky. He could feel her heart beating against his chest, could smell the simple soap she used in her hair. It felt like coming home. They were married 3 weeks later in the small church in Pecos, with Mrs. Patterson standing up for Jane and Cal Peterson standing up for Franklin. It was a simple ceremony, but when Franklin slipped the plain gold band onto Jane's finger and kissed her for the first time as his wife, he felt a profound sense of rightness settle over him. The wedding breakfast was held at the boarding house, with Mrs. Patterson and several other town ladies providing food. Jane wore a simple dress of pale blue that Mrs. Patterson had helped her make, and Franklin thought she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. As they prepared to leave for the ranch, Mrs. Patterson pulled Jane aside. Franklin watched as the older woman spoke quietly to his new wife, saw Jane nod and embrace her. When Jane returned to his side, her eyes were bright. "She said I was the daughter she never had," Jane said softly, "and that she was happy I found you." They rode out to the ranch in Franklin's wagon, Jane sitting close beside him on the bench seat. He told her about the ranch as they traveled, about the house his father had built before dying of fever 10 years back, about the 2 hands who worked for him, about his plans to expand the herd next spring. Jane listened intently, asking questions, and Franklin realized how much he had missed having someone to talk to about these things. He had been alone for so long, focused entirely on work and survival, that he had forgotten what it felt like to share his life with someone. The ranch came into view as the sun was setting, a modest house and barn set against the backdrop of rolling prairie. It was not much, Franklin knew, especially compared to some of the bigger spreads in the area. But it was home and it was paid for, and now he got to share it with Jane. His 2 hands, Miguel and Tom, had made themselves scarce for the evening, giving the newlyweds privacy. Franklin helped Jane down from the wagon and, in a fit of romantic impulse, picked her up and carried her across the threshold. Jane laughed, a sound of pure delight, and Franklin felt his heart swell with happiness. He set her down gently in the main room, suddenly nervous. This was real now. Jane was his wife. This was their home. "It is perfect," Jane said, looking around at the simple but sturdy furniture, the stone fireplace, the kitchen area where Franklin did his basic cooking. "Absolutely perfect." "It needs a woman's touch," Franklin said. "I am not much for decoration." "Then we will work on it together," Jane replied. She turned to face him, and Franklin saw the same nervousness he felt reflected in her eyes. They were married now, truly joined, and everything that meant lay ahead of them. He reached out and took her hand. "Jane, I know this has all happened very fast. If you need time, if you want to go slow, I understand. I did not marry you just to have a woman in my bed. I married you because I love you." Jane's eyes widened. They had not spoken those words yet, not directly. But hearing them now, Franklin knew they were true. He did love her, completely and irrevocably. "I love you too," Jane whispered. "And I do not want to wait. I am your wife, Franklin, truly and completely." He kissed her then, deep and tender, and she responded with a passion that matched his own. They made their way to his bedroom, now their bedroom, and in the gentle darkness they came together as husband and wife, sealing the vows they had made that morning. Later, as they lay tangled together under the quilts, Jane's head resting on Franklin's chest, she spoke softly. "I came to Pecos with nothing but a letter, expecting to find a stranger who would help me out of obligation. Instead, I found you." Franklin stroked her hair, marveling at how natural it felt to have her here beside him. "What did I say when you told me about that letter, when you first arrived?" Jane thought back, a smile playing at her lips. "You said you would help me find Thomas Monroe, and that a man does not just vanish without trace." "No," Franklin said. "I mean when I decided to help you. What did I feel?" Jane lifted her head to look at him in the moonlight coming through the window. "You said someone once helped you when you had nothing." "That is part of it," Franklin agreed, "but there was something else. The moment I saw you step off that stagecoach, clutching that letter like it held all your hope, I knew. You came here with nothing but that letter, and I thought to myself, that is all I need to know. That you had the courage to make this journey, to trust in your brother's word, to keep going even when everything seemed impossible. That told me everything about who you are." "That is all you needed to know," Jane repeated softly, tears gathering in her eyes again. "That is all I needed to know," Franklin confirmed. "Everything else, all the reasons I fell in love with you, those came after. But that first moment, seeing your strength and determination, that was when I knew you were someone special." Jane kissed him, long and sweet. "My brother was right to send me to Pecos. Maybe not for the reasons he thought, but he was right. This is where I was meant to be. With you." They talked long into the night, sharing stories from their pasts, making plans for their future. Franklin told her about his father, about the hard years building up the ranch, about his dreams of making it something substantial. Jane told him more about Samuel, about their childhood, about the quiet life they had led in Missouri. "Do you regret leaving?" Franklin asked at one point. "Your home, everything familiar," Jane considered this. "I regret nothing that brought me to you, and Pecos is my home now. This ranch, this bed, your arms around me, this is home." In the months that followed, Jane transformed the ranch house into a true home. She hung curtains in the windows, planted flowers around the porch, organized the chaos of Franklin's bachelor existence into something warm and welcoming. She learned to cook the hearty meals that Franklin and the hands needed, though she insisted on teaching them all some refinement too. Miguel and Tom, initially wary of having a woman on the ranch, came to adore Jane. She treated them with respect and kindness, learned Spanish from Miguel so she could speak with his wife when she visited, and always made sure there was fresh coffee and food available for the men after long days of work. Franklin watched his wife bloom in her new life. The shadows that had haunted her eyes when she first arrived faded, replaced by contentment and joy. She threw herself into ranch life with the same determination she brought to everything, learning to ride better, helping with the livestock, managing the household accounts with a skill that impressed Franklin. They were happy. Truly, deeply happy. And if Franklin sometimes caught Jane looking thoughtful, a distant expression on her face, he understood. She was thinking of Samuel, of the brother who had loved her enough to send her to safety even in death. She was remembering where she had come from, even as she embraced where she was now. About 6 months after their marriage, Jane came to Franklin with news that made his heart soar. She was pregnant. They would have a child, a family of their own. "Are you happy?" Jane asked, searching his face for his reaction. Franklin picked her up and spun her around, both of them laughing. "Happy does not begin to cover it. A baby, Jane. Our baby." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and Franklin found himself constantly amazed by the changes in Jane's body, the way she glowed with health and vitality. He became protective to the point of being overbearing, not wanting her to do any heavy work, insisting she rest frequently. "Franklin," Jane said one day, exasperated but amused, "I am pregnant, not made of glass. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I will be fine." "I know," Franklin said, "but you are not just any woman. You are my woman, and I will be careful with you whether you like it or not." Jane rolled her eyes but kissed him, and Franklin knew she secretly enjoyed his attentiveness. They prepared the small second bedroom for the baby, painting it and building a cradle. Franklin worked on it every night after supper, determined to make it perfect. Jane sewed blankets and tiny clothes, her face soft with maternal anticipation. In her 8th month, Jane received a letter that surprised them both. It was from San Francisco, from Thomas Monroe. "How did he know to write to you?" Franklin asked, looking at the envelope with confusion. Jane opened it with shaking hands and read aloud, "Dear Mrs. Xavier, I hope this letter finds you well. I recently received correspondence from an attorney in Missouri handling your late brother's affairs. He informed me of Samuel's death and of your journey to find me in Pecos. I cannot express how deeply I regret not being there when you arrived. Samuel was a good man and a trusted partner, and his death was a devastating loss to me personally, beyond just our business dealings. I understand you are now married and settled in Pecos. Please accept my sincere congratulations and my deepest apologies for not being able to honor Samuel's wishes personally. However, I want you to know that Samuel's investment in our venture was substantial, and while the business ultimately failed, I have been working to recoup what I can. Enclosed you will find a bank draft representing half of what I have managed to salvage. It is not the fortune Samuel hoped to make for you, but it is rightfully yours as his heir. I hope it will be of use to you and your husband as you build your life together. Samuel spoke often of you, of how proud he was of his little sister. I know he would be happy to see you settled and cared for. With deepest respect, Thomas Monroe." Jane's hands trembled as she pulled out a bank draft. The amount made both of them gasp. "It was more money than Franklin made in 2 years from the ranch, Jane," Franklin breathed. "This is a fortune." Jane stared at the paper, tears streaming down her face. "Samuel did take care of me. Even in death, even when his plans went wrong, he still managed to provide for me." Franklin held her as she cried, mourning anew for the brother who had loved her so well. When her tears finally subsided, they talked about what to do with the money. "We could expand the ranch," Franklin said. "Buy more land, build a bigger house. Maybe hire more hands, increase the herd significantly. Or we could save it, Jane suggested. For emergencies, for our children's future, for security. In the end, they compromised. They used some of the money to make immediate improvements to the ranch, buying additional breeding stock and hiring another hand. The rest they deposited in the bank in Pecos, a nest egg for the future. Jane wrote back to Thomas Monroe, thanking him for his honesty and his efforts to honor his partnership with Samuel. She told him about Franklin, about the ranch, about the baby coming soon. She wanted Monroe to know that Samuel's last act had indeed led her to safety and happiness, even if not in the way he had planned. 2 weeks later, Jane went into labor. It was a long, difficult birth that left Franklin pacing anxiously outside the bedroom where Mrs. Patterson and the doctor attended to his wife. He could hear Jane's cries of pain, and everyone felt like a knife to his heart. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity but was actually about 12 hours, he heard a different cry. The thin, outraged wail of a newborn baby. Mrs. Patterson emerged, tired but smiling. "You have a son, Franklin, and Jane is asking for you." Franklin rushed into the room to find Jane exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in one of the blankets she had made. She looked up at him with pure love in her eyes. "Meet your son," she said softly. Franklin approached carefully, as though the baby might break, and looked down at the small red face of his child. His son. He felt something fundamental shift inside him, a fierce, protective love unlike anything he had ever experienced. "He is perfect," Franklin whispered. "Absolutely perfect, as are you." "I want to name him Samuel," Jane said, "after my brother, if that is all right with you." Franklin felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I think that is exactly right. Samuel Xavier, he would be honored." Little Samuel proved to be a robust baby with healthy lungs and his mother's auburn hair. Franklin found himself utterly besotted, spending every moment he could spare with his wife and son. He would hold the baby while Jane rested, marveling at the tiny fingers that gripped his thumb, the way Samuel's eyes would open and seem to stare at him with unfocused curiosity. "He has your eyes," Jane said one evening as they sat together watching the sunset, Samuel nursing at her breast. "He has your beauty," Franklin replied, "and hopefully your intelligence. Lord knows he will need it to make up for getting my stubborn streak." Jane laughed, that sound Franklin loved so much. "Our children will be stubborn and smart and beautiful, a dangerous combination. Our children." Franklin repeated, "You want more." "Eventually," Jane said, looking down at Samuel with soft eyes. "Not right away. This was enough excitement for now. But yes, I want more. I want this house filled with children, with life and love and laughter. I want them to never doubt they are loved the way Samuel and I were never sure after our parents died." Franklin leaned over and kissed her forehead. "Then that is what we will have. As many children as you want. This house will overflow with little Xaviers running around causing chaos." "That sounds perfect," Jane murmured. Life settled into a new rhythm with a baby in the house. They were busy, often exhausted, but happier than Franklin had ever imagined possible. He would wake in the night to hear Jane singing softly to Samuel, her voice carrying through the darkness like a lullaby to Franklin's heart as well. The ranch prospered. With the additional investment and Franklin's steady management, they expanded operations significantly. They hired 2 more hands, built a new barn, and increased the herd to 300 head. Franklin's reputation as an honest rancher with quality stock spread, and he began to get contracts to supply cattle to military posts and mining camps. Jane managed the household and the business accounts with equal skill. She corresponded with buyers, kept meticulous records, and somehow managed to make their house a warm, welcoming place while also being a shrewd businesswoman. Franklin often told her she was worth 10 of him. When Samuel was 2 years old, Jane became pregnant again. This time she carried a girl whom they named Sarah after Franklin's mother. Sarah was as different from Samuel as night from day, dark-haired where he was auburn, quiet where he was boisterous, cautious where he was reckless. "They balance each other," Jane observed one afternoon, watching Samuel, now 4 years old, carefully showing 3-year-old Sarah how to pet the new kittens in the barn while she looked on with serious eyes. Franklin wrapped his arms around his wife from behind, pulling her back against his chest. "Like we balance each other." Jane leaned into him, and Franklin thought about the journey that had brought them here. A desperate woman with nothing but a letter, a lonely cowboy looking for purpose, a twist of fate that brought them together. "You ever wonder what would have happened if Thomas Monroe had been here when you arrived?" Franklin asked. "If everything had gone according to your brother's plan?" Jane turned in his arms to face him. "I would have been grateful for his help. I probably would have found work, built a life of some kind. But I would not have this. I would not have you or Samuel or Sarah. I would not have true happiness. No regrets then, not a single one." Jane stood on her toes to kiss him. "I came to Pecos with nothing but a letter, looking for a stranger. Instead, I found my home. I found my heart. I found you." "That is all I needed to know," Franklin murmured against her lips, echoing the thought he had had that first day. "That you had the courage to come here, to keep going. That told me everything." "And you had the kindness to help a stranger," Jane replied. "That told me everything about you." They stood there in the fading afternoon light, watching their children play, the ranch spreading out around them in the land Franklin had worked so hard to build, and Jane had transformed into a home. This was what Samuel Morrison had wanted for his sister when he wrote that letter with shaking, dying hands. Safety, security, love, family, a future full of promise. The letter itself still existed, tucked away in a wooden box in Jane's wardrobe. She kept it along with the few other mementos of her brother. Sometimes Franklin would find her holding it, reading the words again, and he understood. It was a link to the brother who had loved her, the last gift Samuel had been able to give her, but it was also a reminder of how much had changed. The frightened young woman who had clutched that letter like a lifeline was gone, replaced by a confident wife and mother, a skilled rancher and businesswoman, a woman who had found her place in the world and claimed it with both hands. Over the years, Franklin and Jane added 2 more children to their family. Another boy named James who was born when Sarah was 3, and finally another girl named Emma who arrived when Jane was 30. Their house did indeed overflow with life and love and laughter, just as Jane had dreamed. Samuel grew into a fine young man, learning the ranching business from his father with serious dedication. Sarah proved to have her mother's head for figures and her father's stubbornness, a combination that served her well. James was the peacemaker of the family, always trying to smooth over conflicts and keep everyone happy. And Emma was the surprise, wild and fearless, keeping them all on their toes. The ranch continued to prosper. By the time Samuel was 15, they had one of the most successful operations in the county. Franklin trained his eldest son carefully, teaching him everything about managing cattle, reading the land, treating workers fairly. Samuel absorbed it all with the intensity of someone who knew this would one day be his responsibility. Jane, meanwhile, had become something of a force in Pecos society. She organized charity drives for families in need, helped establish a proper school so children did not have to travel to the next town for education, and served as an unofficial counselor to young women who found themselves in difficult circumstances. She never forgot what it felt like to arrive with nothing, to be dependent on the kindness of strangers, and she made sure no one in her community felt that alone. Mrs. Patterson lived to a ripe old age, eventually moving into a small house Franklin and Jane built for her on their ranch property. She spent her final years surrounded by the Xavier children who adored her, telling them stories and teaching them the propriety she had once insisted upon with Jane. When she died peacefully in her sleep at 83, Jane mourned her like the mother she had become. Thomas Monroe wrote occasionally over the years. His business ventures in California had eventually succeeded, and he became a wealthy man. He never married, though, and in his letters there was often a note of regret, of roads not taken. When Samuel Xavier was 20, Monroe wrote to ask if the young man might consider coming to San Francisco to learn the merchant trade. As I had once hoped to teach his uncle, Monroe wrote, Franklin and Jane left the decision to their son. Samuel considered carefully, talked it over with his parents, and finally decided to go. I love the ranch, he told them, but I want to see more of the world first, learn different things. I will come back. This is my home, but I think I need to stretch my wings a bit first. They let him go, though it broke their hearts a little. But they had raised him to be independent, to think for himself, and they could not fault him for doing exactly that. He spent 3 years in San Francisco, learning business from Monroe, seeing the rapidly growing city, experiencing a life very different from the ranch. But he did come back, just as he had promised, bringing with him a sharp mind for business and a deep appreciation for the life his parents had built. He also brought a wife, a sensible young woman named Catherine, whom he had met in San Francisco. She was the daughter of a banker, educated and refined, but she took to ranch life with enthusiasm and grace. She reminds me of you, Franklin told Jane one evening as they watched Samuel and Catherine walking together toward the barn, clearly deep in conversation about some plan or another. How so? Jane asked. She is stronger than she looks, and she adapts. That is a rare quality, Jane smiled. I like her. I think she will make Samuel very happy, and she did. Samuel and Catherine settled into the small house Franklin and Jane built for them on the ranch property. And soon there were grandchildren, adding yet another generation to the legacy Samuel Morrison's letter had inadvertently created. As Franklin and Jane grew older, they would often sit on their porch in the evening, watching the sun set over the land that had become theirs, listening to the sounds of their family around them. They never took it for granted, never forgot how easily things could have been different. I got your letter today, Jane said one evening when they were both in their 50s. From Thomas Monroe. Franklin raised an eyebrow. My letter? I have never corresponded with the man. Not literally yours, Jane laughed. But he wrote to tell me he is finally retiring, moving back east. And he wanted me to know that settling Samuel Morrison's affairs, making sure I got what was owed to me, was the best business decision he ever made. Not for the money, but because it let him honor a good man and help create all of this. She gestured at the ranch, at the houses scattered across the property, at the children playing in the distance. You should write back and invite him to visit, Franklin suggested. Let him see what his honesty and integrity helped build. Jane did write, and Monroe did visit, making the journey to Pecos one last time. He was an old man now, his hair white and his back bent, but his eyes were sharp and kind. He spent a week at the ranch, meeting the Xavier children and grandchildren, seeing what his partnership with Samuel Morrison had inadvertently created. On his last evening there, he sat with Franklin and Jane on the porch, 3 people who had never expected their lives to intertwine, now bound together by history and consequence. Samuel Morrison was one of the finest men I ever knew, Monroe said quietly. When I heard he had died, that his sister had come looking for me and I had not been there, I was devastated. I thought I had failed him utterly. "You did not fail," Jane said firmly. "You honored his memory by being honest, by making sure I received what was rightfully mine. That took integrity, especially when you could have just kept it all and I would never have known." "The thought never crossed my mind," Monroe replied. "Samuel trusted me. How could I betray that trust, even in death?" He paused, looking out over the ranch in the fading light. "But I see now that it all worked out far better than any of us could have planned. He wanted you safe and cared for, Jane. He wanted you to have a good life. And you do." "I do," Jane agreed, taking Franklin's hand. "I have everything I could ever want." Monroe left the next morning, and they never saw him again. He died 2 years later in his sleep, in the house where he had been born in Massachusetts. But his last letter to Jane spoke of peace, of a life well lived, of gratitude for the chance to honor his friend's memory. Franklin and Jane lived long, full lives. They saw their children grow and have families of their own. They watched the ranch continue to prosper under Samuel's management, saw Sarah marry a doctor and move to Austin, James become a lawyer in San Antonio, and Emma surprised them all by becoming a teacher. As they aged, they took fewer active roles in the daily running of the ranch, content to advise and support while the younger generation took over. But they never stopped being partners, never stopped facing life together as they had from that first day when Jane had stepped off the stagecoach with nothing but a letter and a desperate hope. In their 70s, as they sat together on the porch they had sat on for so many years, Jane sometimes talked about that day, about the terror and determination that had carried her through. "I was so scared," she admitted once. "I tried to seem brave, but inside I was terrified. What if Thomas Monroe was not there? What if he refused to help? What if Samuel had been wrong? But you came anyway," Franklin said. "That is what mattered. You had the courage to take the chance." "And you had the kindness to help a stranger," Jane replied. The same exchange they had had so many times over the years, a call and response that had become their own private liturgy. Franklin Xavier died at 78. Peacefully in his sleep with Jane beside him as she had been for over 50 years. He slipped away in the night, and when Jane woke to find him gone, she held his hand one last time and whispered her love and her thanks for a life beyond anything she could have imagined. Jane lived another 3 years, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She was sharp until the end, still managing to comment on ranch business and family affairs with her characteristic insight. But she missed Franklin terribly, and everyone could see she was ready to go. On a warm spring afternoon, sitting on the porch she had shared with Franklin for so many years, Jane Morrison Xavier closed her eyes and did not open them again. She died as she had lived, with quiet grace and surrounded by love. At her funeral, her eldest son Samuel spoke about his mother's courage, about the journey she had made with nothing but a letter and determination. He spoke about how she had transformed not just their ranch but the entire community, how her kindness and strength had touched countless lives. "My mother came to Pecos with nothing," Samuel said, his voice thick with emotion. "She was looking for a stranger who she hoped would help her. Instead, she found my father, and together they built something that will last for generations. They built a family. They built a home. They built a legacy of love and hard work and integrity that we will carry forward." In the wooden box that Jane had kept in her wardrobe all those years, her children found the letter. The paper was yellowed now, the ink faded, but the words were still clear. The last message from Samuel Morrison to his beloved sister. The words that had sent her on a journey that changed everything. Alongside it was another paper, one Jane had written years before. It was addressed to her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, to all the descendants who would come after her. In it, she told the story of how she had arrived in Pecos with nothing but a letter, how a cowboy named Franklin Xavier had helped her, how love had found them both when they were not looking for it. "Life will throw you challenges," she had written. "You will face moments when you have nothing but hope and determination to carry you forward. In those moments, remember that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to keep going despite it. Remember that kindness matters, that integrity matters, that love matters most of all. And remember that sometimes the best things in life come not from careful plans working out, but from those plans falling apart and forcing you to find a different path." She had ended the letter with the words Franklin had said to her so many times over the years, words that had become the foundation of their life together. "I arrived with nothing but a letter. Your grandfather said that was all he needed to know." And from that single moment of kindness and courage, all of you were born. Never underestimate the power of choosing to help, of choosing to hope, of choosing to love. Those choices echo through generations. The Xavier Ranch continued to prosper, passing from one generation to the next. The house was expanded and updated over the years, but that porch where Franklin and Jane had spent so many evenings remained unchanged, a reminder of where it all began. And in Pecos, Texas, there stands to this day a historical marker that tells the story of Jane Morrison Xavier, the woman who arrived with nothing but a letter and built an empire of love. It speaks of her charity work, her business acumen, her role in establishing the school, her decades of service to the community. But it begins with those fateful words that her grandson Samuel had carved there. She arrived with nothing but a letter. A cowboy said that was all he needed to know. And from that moment, a legacy was born. The sun still sets over that ranch, painting the Texas sky in shades of orange and pink, just as it did on the day Jane Morrison first arrived in Pecos. The cattle still graze on the rolling prairie. The house still stands solid and welcoming. And on the porch, you can almost see them if you look carefully in the golden light of evening, two figures sitting close together, hands intertwined, watching over all they built together. A desperate journey ended. A lonely heart opened. A letter that led not to its intended recipient but to something far better. Two souls that found each other against all odds and chose to build a life together, one day at a time, one challenge at a time, one moment of love at a time. That is all anyone needs to know. The rest is just details. But what beautiful details they were, stretched across decades of laughter and tears, triumph and hardship, but most of all, love. The kind of love that starts with a simple act of kindness and grows into something that spans generations. In the church in Pecos, there are two graves side by side, marked with simple headstones. Franklin Xavier and Jane Morrison Xavier, beloved husband and wife, devoted parents and grandparents, pillars of the community. The dates of their births and deaths are there, but there is one more line carved beneath all the standard information. That was all I needed to know. And it was. It truly was.